Hey everybody, welcome to Peck Report. So last time I shared with you that we're going to be doing, I'm going to be showing you some pre-interviews that I conducted with some guests that are helping me out with a future project. It's going to be released a little later this year. Now these interviews aren't the typical like back and forth conversational type of interviews. They are pre-interviews for a future project, but there's a lot of great information. So it's literally me just asking the question and them getting right to the information. So I wanted to show that to you. Today we're going to be checking in with William Ramsey. So here is part one of my pre-interview with William Ramsey. Check this out. William Ramsey, can you introduce yourself and tell us about your background in researching criminal activity?
Well, I started out as an author. I was interested in finding out more about the occult, which also coincides with criminal activity. So in that regard, I was definitely a researcher into the West Memphis Three, which I believe to be a satanic influence crime, and that type of criminal activity, which involved the murder of three 12-year-old children and the real serious abuse of those children as well that took place in Arkansas, outside of Memphis, west of Memphis, actually. And so that would be really my interest. So I think that when you talk about the occult, it overlaps with criminal activity. So I became kind of, in some ways, a true crime writer, I think, with that book, and also my research into a series of murders that where the occult and criminal activity coincide, which is known publicly as the smiley face killers. So that crime has been taking place in the U.S. for the last 20 years, and it does coincide with like an occult underground. Mm-hmm. So I just finished my second movie about that. And that was titled The Smiley Face Killers, Volume 2, The Global Slaughter Continues, because it involves the disappearance and water deaths of men all over the world, really.
Where can people find that if they want to check it out?
It's available on Vimeo right now. So all my films are on Vimeo. You can just look up William Ramsey Vimeo, and you can see what's available right now. Good
deal. Does child sex trafficking and pedophilia come up in your research?
Yes, so I think that's pretty grim material, but I definitely, particularly with Crowley and my more recent research into the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, which I did a number of interviews with knowledgeable people about that scandal, and something that I've followed where there was international sex trafficking taking place with a little kind of a patina or an element of cultism. So there was definitely something very strange about that. I read the biography of a woman by the name of Virginia Roberts. She got married. Her name is Virginia Giuffre, but I was surprised to find the statuary of Pan all over the place affiliated with Jeffrey Epstein. So she said that in his house in Manhattan, he had a special walkway that was covered with this god Pan, and that was also seen at his infamous island, Little St. James, that is in the Caribbean. So I would think that, yes. So I think this theme of, unfortunately, sex trafficking does involve pedophilia as well.
Mm. What do you know about the child sex trafficking industry in America today?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on that. I wouldn't say that would be one of my primary subject. I would say that I think it's happening much more than people realize. There was somebody in Northern California who was a doctor who just got arrested. There's been a lot of significant arrests under the Trump administration, thank God. So I think that people are addressing it, but it really is an underground. And I think a lot of it takes place through dark web, and there used to be a lot of it on Backpage, is my understanding, but that got shut down as well. So you got to give credit to the Department of Justice for doing that. But I wouldn't say it would be a focus of my interest. I would definitely say looking into the occult and true crime would probably be much more kind of my central focus.
Definitely. Who was Jeffrey Epstein?
Well, that's a great question, because he had a very shady life. He was kind of an underground person. He grew up in New York. Jeffrey Epstein, people found out, kind of peeled the layers of his personality. He was self-proclaimed a financier, but he never had the proper documentation or set up to be anything of a financial advisor or investor. There's very few documents of his filings, these filings that are necessary to do investments. But he died when he died last year. He had a net worth of over $500 million. So there's a lot of mystery of where that money came from. So asking a question about, I would say that the title International Man of Mystery definitely applies to Jeffrey Epstein, moving around from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in a plane. But I think that Jeffrey Epstein wasn't just a one-man show. He was working with Ghislaine Maxwell, who was the daughter of Robert Maxwell, a known Mossad intel asset, and also had associations with very well-known either legal or business people in this country, such as Alan Dershowitz, who was a longtime friend, who shows up in all these cases and actually is being sued by Virginia Giuffre right now. So it's weird to see him defending President Trump in Congress while he's being civilly sued by Virginia Giuffre for lying about whether he was a partaker or purveyor of the underage sex trafficking that Jeffrey Epstein was operating. And Jeffrey Epstein, some insight into Jeffrey Epstein is made by aircraft logs and an infamous black book. And that infamous black book, if you read through it, it's an indicator of how well networked Jeffrey Epstein was. It doesn't necessarily show that he's calling those people all the time, but he had personal phone numbers for Donald Trump, the Prince Andrew, all of these well-known figures, celebrities who were on his plane with the records. So many people were involved. And so Jeffrey Epstein was in my opinion, was clearly providing was involved in this kind of international sex trafficking operation of underage men and women from all over. And I don't think it was fully disclosed. Of the totality of his operation was not disclosed by investigators because of his death. It was very advantageous to all the people in those black book, Bill Gates and all these other figures, that this investigation stopped, because he was supposedly trafficking underage kids from, there were allegations from Venezuela, some of whom were never seen again. So they were either sold off, they just don't know. So he's a very mysterious figure, and I believe that he was able to skirt the law by constantly moving from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So he was very smart in that regard. And I think he was handled. I mean, Wexner was the guy who started Victoria's Secret, and under the depositions that were taken during his criminal, I think it's either a criminal suit or civil suit from 2007, he was still flying around in a plane, a Gulfstream that was owned by Wexner, who was a multi-billionaire. So there's also the whiff of intelligence or intel involved in Jeffrey Epstein, of blackmailing, taking videotapes. They all said that he had videotapes of people for years. So he was taking videotapes in his mansion that was in New York, on his plane known as the Lolita Express. And he seemed like to be involved in blackmailing or obtaining information on political, cultural, and scientific figures all throughout the United States and potentially the world, France and other people. So he's mixing in all of these different environments. There's an infamous picture of him, Harvey Weinstein, and Ghislaine Maxwell at I think it was the 18th birthday of Prince Andrew's daughter. So these guys are mixing in very elite, circles. And the biography of Virginia Giuffre shows some insight that these guys are constantly following around. There's tons of kids that they're involving in sex trafficking from kids in Palm Beach High School that they're being paid off. And you don't really see the totality of it, but it seemed like what Jeffrey Epstein was doing, particularly with this one victim, Virginia Giuffre, is setting them up to go send out. So Virginia Giuffre, it's a fascinating element of her story, is that she was sent out to sleep with Senator Mitchell, who was a senator, and also Richardson, who was the governor of New Mexico. And these were people involved in very high-level political negotiations involving the UN, and in Richardson's case. And Mitchell was involved in negotiating the Palestinian-Israeli, peace process. So these guys are heavily involved in very delicate international, negotiations that involve intrigue, where more than likely they were filmed in this sex trafficking thing. So and there's so many more cases involved in Jeffrey Epstein. There was a hearing that one of the main issues surrounding the Jeffrey Epstein case was called the victim's crime. Victim. I can't remember the the meaning of the acronym, but the idea behind it was to give victims of these crimes more rights in court. And in the interest of that, the judge that was overseeing the Epstein criminal case allowed many of his victims to come and give statements. And there were many victims that had the courage to go on the record and talk about the trauma and stress that they endured by being one of the trafficking victims. It's remarkable that it's taking place these days in the United States. So Jeffrey Epstein was like a multi-faceted individual with very different interests, but it's pretty clear to me that he was running a sex trafficking operation at the highest level, probably getting paid monies that are never traceable, So he was really kind of an international criminal. So asking that question, who's Jeffrey Epstein, is really, it's a tough one to give a very, one-line answer. It's just a very complex, and people are still finding things out about him. They're still writing things about him. There are ties between people he knew and an NXIVM cult in upstate New York. So there's all kinds of ties that he had that the public doesn't know or may never find out, which is unfortunate.
Wow. So of the things that is known, like officially, stuff that's on the books, and then we'll get into the unofficial stuff later, but officially, what crimes did Jeffrey Epstein commit that we know about?
Well, sex trafficking is a crime.
Yeah.
I think that he was arrested and convicted of having sex with somebody under 16 in the state of Florida. So and that was, I think, in 2008, when Dershowitz and all these other people were his attorneys. So he was a convicted sex offender. As far as the other allegations of crimes, it doesn't seem like he ever really stopped. So it's pretty clear that he was trafficking children, or underage girls at least, that we know of, between different jurisdictions. So he was crossing state lines, taking children there. So that's definitely a crime. What else he was involved in trafficking or bringing through his plane, God only knows. I don't really know. But there is so much suspicious stuff around him that certainly he seemed like he was arrested for trafficking minors under the age of 14. That was his most recent arrest in 2019, something he was never convicted of because he supposedly killed himself in jail. Like I said, when he died in jail, there were probably 100 to 1,000 very rich people who exhaled a sigh of relief because he probably had blackmail material on all of them going back. So Jeffrey Epstein was really a 30-year operation going back to the mid-90s all the way up to 2019 of making money, blackmailing people, really subterfuge stuff. But it's unknown the totality of his criminal activity. And that's really a shame.
Yeah, definitely. Unofficially, stuff that may be off the books. Do you believe there are other crimes that Jeffrey Epstein has committed that we haven't discussed yet?
Yeah, I would say blackmail would be one of them. That would probably be a crime under any circumstances, or extortion or something like that, like I have stuff on you. A RICO suit, which would be a racketeer, influence, corrupt organization, because he was clearly working with other people who knew what was going on, in my opinion, primarily Ghislaine Maxwell. So there's all kinds of other criminal activities. We don't know the drugs, whether he was trafficking in drugs, organ trafficking. There's a lot of talk about organ trafficking these days. So the totality, influence peddling, he might have been, according to some researchers, he was involved in setting up the Clinton Foundation, which was a huge money laundering slush fund that they never got arrested or criminally prosecuted for. So he was involved. We know that he was involved in another kind of a Ponzi scheme that one of his associates went to jail for, and Epstein never really went to jail. And one of the reasons they think that he was able to skirt kind of law is that he was also an informant for the FBI, because Mueller said so. Mueller said so back in 2009 that he was, I think he was in writing that he said so. So there's all kinds of problems with Epstein that, we'll never know. Money laundering, all kinds of things that he could have easily been involved in.
Definitely. Now, as far as the occult stuff with all of this, there's a lot of people today that don't believe child sex abuse and Satanism have anything in common because of the so-called satanic panic decades ago. What can you tell us about that case, and how has it been misrepresented?
Well, the Epstein case clearly involved some of the elements of, there's no known aspect from any woman's testimony that there was overt kind of occultism. Like I mentioned, Virginia Giuffre talked about the God Pan representation of the devil. They found, one of the people found a black cloak in Ghislaine Maxwell's closet, like something Eyes Wide Shut type stuff. And there was also this weird temple that I'm pretty sure there was a statue of Horus that one time that was on the top of that temple that is in a kind of Egyptian motif. And there's all kinds of strange berms and signs on that island. So the totality of what was going on there may not be known. I mean, they're hanging out with people like Kevin Spacey, who's heavily, I would say, in my opinion, heavily involved in the occult, and friends with the Clintons. So there's a network of very underground kind of sketchy people with Jeffrey Epstein. How much so that, the totality of how much he knew about the occult, I don't really know, but there is definitely sex trafficking. There are some sex trafficking cases that involve the occult. If you look at the McMartin case, there's more evidence that came forward that the tunnels that the kids claimed were there were existent. That just came out in an FBI release. There was the Finders case that I've done research on that involved occultism, like literally the kids witnessed the slaughter of lambs that were occultism, and that there was Satanism, and there was all kinds of mind control. And even in the McMartin case, they found in this thing that there was a paper plate with a pentagram on it. So there's all kinds of elements in those cases. Finders, there's the Fuster case. And we could jump forward through your questions, but there's also the Hosanna Church, which involved blatant Satanism, child sex abuse. And that was the basis for True Detective. That all took place outside of Baton Rouge in Louisiana. A truly incredible case that is very well documented, because the police investigated and put these people away. So it was all independently documented, but the Satanism in that is terrible. Blacked out windows, pentagrams, candles, just the worst of the worst. So some of the sex abuse definitely, in my opinion, involves the occult. Not all that I know of, to a greater or lesser degree.
Yeah, definitely. Now, this also involves the entertainment industry. Who is Ian Watkins, and what was he involved in?
So Ian Watkins was the lead singer of a band called the Lost Prophets, which is much more famous in the UK than in the United States. But that was a case that was a very grim case, that he wasn't just a mere pedophile. He was an infant rapist and actually used to write messages. And they had the messages on one of these that went into the court case. And he said that raping kids was mega lols, like a little LULZ. So he got arrested. It was a remarkable case because he was a fairly famous guy. And there is a whiff of occultism in that. I wrote about Ian Watkins in my book, Children of the Beast, because Peaches Geldof, who was the daughter of Bob Geldof, kind of got into the OTO. OTO was Aleister Crowley's. It was actually a German secret society that Aleister Crowley became the head of in 1925. It stands for Ordo Templi Orientis. But she became briefly interested, but she was a critic of Ian Watkins and seemed to know what he was up to before he got arrested. He got a life sentence, but the court cases are horrific, and he literally I mean, I know that he was into the occult, the totality of which I couldn't ascertain from what was there because he was already breaking the law. But it was a kind of a sex trafficking. He was engaged in unspeakable abominations where he would talk to women who were pregnant and try to entice them to have him spend time with their kids. So he was a devil, a real monster. And that's a real case. That's another documented case that you can read if you can stomach it. You can read the court files. So Ian Watkins is incredible. And there's a tie. It's kind of, I don't know if he ever got arrested for sex trafficking. He got arrested for sex abuse. But it's kind of like a trafficking because he was seeking out victims. Yeah, so Ian Watkins was a true nightmare case. And Peaches Geldof, unfortunately, she had like an OTO tattoo, and she died of a heroin overdose. So that, you know, everything that touches this kind of occult, just they meet and as often meet an end that is terrible, a terrible end.
Yeah, definitely. It's crazy to hear about that because I remember that band in high school. They had like one or two singles and then they kind of faded out. But I actually remember when they came out. It's crazy.
See, I've never heard of them, but I've talked to people in the UK and they know the Lost Prophets. Most people do, but yeah.
Yeah, wow. Now, famed filmmaker Stanley Kubrick was also involved in the occult and pedophilia. Can you tell us some of the background on him and how he was connected?
Well, he was notorious for filming and directing the film Lolita, which was based on the Nabokov book Lolita, which is scandalous at that time, which is about the relationship of a man with an underage girl. And that came out, well, there's been reports that he was abusing one of the lead actresses on the set. It hasn't been verified, but I have a pretty, the credible source has claimed that he abused them and also abused other children. So, and it's weird, too, because he was involved in the film 2001, A Space Odyssey with Arthur C. Clarke, who was also a sex abuser of little boys or underage boys in Sri Lanka. Ceylon was the new place because he moved there in a ping pong establishment, which ties into Comet Ping Pong. But it's weird, and that ping pong motif was actually in Lolita. There is a scene of the two kind of main characters playing ping pong. So Kubrick himself, and you can go through the kind of list of his films, but 2001 was definitely an occult film. And the key to 2001 and the mystery of the monolith is actually in Clarke's book. So what happened is Clarke wrote the book, and they were supposed to come. Kubrick actually pulled a fast one on Clarke because when the books was supposed to come out concurrently with the film, and Kubrick would not give the release because he was part of the book to Clarke. So the film came out, but the book didn't at the same time. The book came out later. But inside the book, you can read and you can see the numerology, the occult numerology that I've covered a lot of in my books, or, Occult Hollywood, which is kind of my film. But it's an 11. It's basically 11 feet tall. It has the dimensions of 93, and it's 1 foot wide. So 93 is Aleister Crowley's number. I don't think it's a coincidence. And so you have these two guys who were kind of illuminated super geniuses, but not tied to anything pertaining to the Christian ethos. They really are both occultists, and the occultism pervades Clarke as well, but also involved in what seems to be involved in pedophilia. And you can see that same motif through the final film of Stanley Kubrick, which is Eyes Wide Shut, right? Eyes Wide Shut, which is based on a book called Traum Novelle, which was written by, what's his name? But it's interesting because the guy who wrote Traum Novelle was in a magazine with Aleister Crowley, The Fatherland. So there's actually interesting ties in between the Crowley, who's clearly a pedophile, and the writer of Traum Novelle, which is Dream Story, which is the basis for Eyes Wide Shut. So Eyes Wide Shut follows the path of this guy through an evening where he gets drawn into basically a sex magic ritual that takes place at a mansion involving 11 servitors. So the 11 number pops up again. And then one of the terrible aspects of it is at the very end, their child goes off with people who attended these parties with a guy by the name of Ziegler, which translates to bricklayer, which translates to mason. So you can tell, and there's all kinds of occult ties in that. So you can see the spiral staircase they go up. Ziegler clearly has insignias for not the Illuminati, but for one of these early secret society groups on his doorways. And you can see the mind control that goes on through that. It's a very deep, it's a very deep film, and also shows how the deep understanding of the occult that Kubrick had. But at the very end, sorry, I didn't get to finish that, but
go ahead.
At the very end, their daughter goes off with these two young guys, and it just has that element of pedophilia. So you can see that in Kubrick's life and in his films, and there's something tying in between the occultism and this this ability to just disregard moral and human norms.
Yeah. Yeah, and even today he still has a huge fan base, which is insane. Now, this isn't only in America, but throughout the world. What can you tell us about the Kidwelly sex cult?
So the Kidwelly, in my book, I titled that section of my book "The Crowley Cult in Britain," because it was heavily involved in the occult. I mean, the guy read from the book Crowley's Book of the Law, which was supposedly dictated to him by a being called Aiwass in Egypt in 1904 that he later revealed to be Satan. Aiwass was just a code name for the devil, which he admits so much in his writings, which I can quote in detail. But the Crowley cult, the girl was abused by the age of 7 by Colin Bately. He was the head leader. He had no teeth. He's a very scary guy. She wrote a book called The Devil on the Doorstep, My Escape from a Satanic Sex Cult. And she was trafficked too. So you see the sex trafficking and occultism, and they literally had rituals. That cult had all kinds of, he had kind of Colin Bately had kind of a terrifying control over these women that were around him. And I think that he wasn't the only one convicted. There were 2 other women with him who were convicted. So they were criminals, criminally prosecuted and tried and convicted. But she was a prostitute. She estimated she slept with 1,800 men. That's just an incredible. She had a child she didn't know the parent of. It just goes on and on. He indoctrinated her with all kinds of weird phraseology and ideas. He quoted Crowley. He says, "Every man and woman is a star," which is a direct quote from the Book of the Law. So he used to say all this stuff that was really like he talked about the abyss, the palace, all the stuff that Crowley would use. He named his 2 Rottweilers, Tutankhamun and Sekhet from Egypt, the Egypt pantheon, referred to them as Satan's own canines. The cult just went on and on. There's tons of information. So they had tattoos. All the members of his group had tattoos of an ankh and the eye of Horus, and they wore upside crosses around their neck. They were told not to talk with people outside of the group. He said to her, this Bately guy said, "You have to pass certain tests just as it is written in the Book of the Law." So it's just really grim material, but you can go into detail about that. But clearly influenced by Crowley, and had the sex trafficking and just pure occultism, like not even adulterated. Really Crowley focused occultism.
Mm-hmm. All right, hope you've enjoyed that. If you want the rest of the interview, you got to go be a member. Go become a member at dailyrenegade.com. Be a member today. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year. I suggest getting the $100 a year because you get 2 months for free, which is a great deal, and you only got to pay for it once. You don't have to think about it again for a while. So go become a member, go in the members section, and find the video. You'll be able to check out part 2 of my pre-interview with William Ramsey. Thank you so much, everybody. Until next time, take care. God bless. All right, members only. Thank you so much for being a member. Without further ado, here is part 2 of my interview, my pre-interview with William Ramsey. Check this out. Speaking of Crowley, Crowley and Leah Hersig committed a horrible crime in Sicily. Can you tell us about that?
Right. So Crowley, after he left the United States in 1918, he went back to England. He got this idea that he was going to make a magical fraternity. He actually was traveling through Italy at the time, and he did some kind of weird ritual and determined that the right place was in Sicily. And so he made his magical fraternity in the northern part of Sicily and engaged, and he decorated the whole place in really scary. He called it the Chamber of Nightmares. So he decorated it very scarily, but he also brought somebody from the U.S. whose name was Leah Hersig, but also another woman named Shumway. And his idea was to kind of take away any shame. Like, he basically would have sex in front of the kids. But not only he thought that it was trying to take away the kind of shame involved in sex, but he also, there was a book that he always jotted down all of his magical writings. So it was kind of like the magician's duty to record everything that he did. That's why there's so much knowledge about Crowley, because he actually wrote down whether it was what took place in Algeria, or whether it was the elemental working or anything like that. He was writing all the stuff down. So the particular writing that he did from the time he was at this magical fraternity, the Abbey of Thelema in Cefalù. Thelema means will, translates to 93 in the Kabbalah. So, when people would go in there, they would come from the UK or anybody supposedly to come and sit at the foot of the master. But what he recorded in there was his practices with Leah Hersig, which unfortunately involved coprophilia and child rape, their own kids. So he would use kind of euphemisms to talk about himself and her. But one of the things that he wrote was, and that's not really, this book is not in his corpus. It's not in the main books of what he would read for his magical. It was really just kind of in his notes that were compiled, I think, by John Simons, who was his literary executor. But he wrote, if I quote, it is, now I, the god, have choked her god in dung and bred the basilisk, reared the fiend, Satan Alastrel, which was her magical name, to burn in hell with me, to burn, to wrath, to exalt, to expend, to unleash the word of Thelema, and I, the worm, have trilled my slug-slow slime across her breasts, so that her motherhood is turned and her breast itch with lust of incest. She hath given her 2-year-old bastard boy to her lewd lover's whim of sodomy, hath taught him speech and act, things indefinitely abhorred with her own beastly carcass. She hath tongued her 5-month girl and asked its father to deflower it. And it goes on, and he says he loved it all. He dropped each roll of filth around his tongue. All this because he loved her. He loved her, nor God, nor man, nor beast, nor devil has loved. And she's of sound Satan stock. I recognized her, the stuff of my ideal fiend whore, and under my fierce thumbs her clay's masterpiece. The summit beauty of it is her own chief asset, her raw clay's red ochre, the volcano brand on her still smoking and charred go-kart. So it just goes on. I've wanted to do necrophilia. So he's basically, in this regard, he's talking about raping his own kids with Leah Hersig.
Yeah, it's horrifying, and it's horrifying that he's not the only one. There's people doing that kind of stuff today. Can you so the John Benet Ramsey case comes up as well. There might be some people who are watching that might be too young to really remember that. So can you first give us some background on what the public is aware of, and then tell us about the occult links that you found in the John Benet Ramsey case?
Well, somebody has done some very good research about the occult links, and so I'd be referencing their research.
Sure.
But she died, I can't remember the date, but it was Christmas Day, I believe, and she disappeared. If people don't know the full case, she disappeared, and the police came, and she was found. There was a note by the parents. She was later discovered by the father in the downstairs room, and it was a very strange case, but there was all kinds of strange things about her that, Cyril Wecht, who is a very famous investigator. He's a forensic scientist. He said that if she was alive and he looked at her autopsy, the parents would have been arrested because there was proof that she was being raped. So something very dark was happening in that family. And there's very strange times and dates and people in costumes. And the kitchen was decorated like a Masonic order with black and white checks, where the idea is that you are above good and evil. You walk above good and evil. And JonBenet Ramsey's dead. I mean, even her name is weird. Like it's an amalgam of her and her mom's name. And she's clearly sexualized in those videos that are taken of her when she's at these pageants and, with makeup and her hair's done. So it's really dark. I have to go back and look at that documentation that this guy wrote about. But it's really, I mean, I think that it's hard for people to believe that there could be little kids being trafficked among friends. And there were rumors among the people there that, and I've heard this actually in other circumstances, not just the Ramsey family, but that there's a first party that ends at 11, and then the real dark occult party happens after that. So people think that something like that happened again and again in the Ramsey family, and that was really it. So there is some, like, I don't know if she was sex trafficked, but she was definitely abused. And who did the abuse, I don't know if people will ever know, but it was very strange because I think John Ramsey, after his wife died, he married the mother of a girl who'd been killed in the Caribbean. I can't remember the girl who was killed in the Caribbean. I forgot her name. I forgot her killer's name, but she disappeared down there. I mean, John Ramsey was very strange. I don't remember all the facts. So, but yeah, the JonBenet Ramsey case goes very, very dark.
Wow.
And it really centers around the family. There's no outside. They would like you to believe there was an outside influence. But I mean, for me, looking at all the facts of that case, it's about incest, sex abuse, and something that terrible happened around their own child.
Concerning sex trafficking and pedophilia, what's the most shocking, horrific, dark, yet credible case that you've ever come upon?
Well, I think it just goes back to what I was talking about earlier, which is the Hosanna Church. Literally super dark because it was under the guise of being a church. There was literally a pastor, Louis LaMonica, and just there were dedications. It was in Ponchatoula, and dedications to Satan, sexual relations with children, and it involved a variety of different people. There were other people who were involved with the pastor. And the congregation didn't know it. There were killing of animals, drinking of blood during sex ceremonies, sex with children. There were orgies. Children were put in the middle. There were women. 8 adults took part. There were confessions. There were 260 pages of explicit sexual writings. So that for me was probably the most horrific and the most very well recorded, not really referenced so much as it should be, case of pedophilia and occultism intertwined.
What kind of person were you before, and now in your line of work, how are you helping to fight against the evils of the world?
Well, that's a good question. I think the person I was before was somebody who accepted things as the way they were. Like, I think my life before Christ was, this is just the normal world, maybe the best of all possible worlds, maybe that kind of view. Pangloss, from Voltaire. But I think for me, when I came to a knowledge of Christ, it was, we have to take action and speak up. So I think that would be the difference, is that we all have to do our part. So I think that that's really what inspired me to be vocal and put information out to other people, is that this really is happening. These type of things happen. There's facts. There's actually other people who've done the research and the legwork. So to bullhorn that, we're called to expose evil. We're called to do that. And I think that when for not being a Christian, I probably would have just let things be as they were. So I feel like I'm doing my part as part of the body of Christ to try to say, hey, no, this really is happening. This is real. There is Satanism. There's evil at work in the world. So I think that that's probably among many other, once I came to a knowledge of Christ, my whole life changed. I was a totally different person. My whole outlook was totally different. It happened a long time ago when I was 17. I was raised as a Christian, but so I think that my view of, kind of trying to look out for my fellow man is really kind of because I wanted to know for myself, so once I found out for myself, I think without being in the body of Christ, I would have just gone on with my life. But I think that that's important. I think that's an important message for everybody. Every Christian is put your flag down in the place that you are and take a stand for righteousness and take a stand for the Lord, while you're alive on this earth, especially when so many things are happening bad. There's tons of victims. We have to kind of work within the powers we have. But I think if more people took a stand and stood up for things, I think that things would be a lot better. And there wouldn't be these victims you hear about in the Epstein case. You don't hear about these people who are traumatized. Their lives really aren't the same. They don't adapt to reality the same if they're abused as kids. They're not. Their relationships are changed and tarnished. So I think it's really important to expose this evil and also expose why it's not being, I think that one of the themes that you've addressed, which is important, is the criminality.
Yeah.
Is that you expose them. And so then you see that the legal system moves into action because then they know. Then the public knows. Because if you change, most of the public are outraged by these evils. So if the public knows and you're informing the public, then the legal system will hopefully follow suit.
Great answer, and I absolutely agree. Just got a couple more. What can parents do to protect their children, and what can children do to protect themselves?
Well, I think it goes back to the same theme of the earlier question. You got to watch your kids, but also hopefully kids will speak out. I think we've trained kids to look for stranger danger and all that, but the parents also have to watch their kids and watch family members and things like that. I think that's important, but keeping your kids close, I think, is really just being there if you can. If you're lucky enough to have be around the house with your kids, it's a real blessing because they're just under your watchful eye. So I think that that's really the important aspect of keeping your kids out of danger.
Absolutely. Last one. Do you believe there is hope that sex trafficking and pedophilia can be done away with in our country? And if so, what would it take to achieve that goal?
I think for sure that it all can be done away with. I think there'll always be the problem of sex trafficking and pedophilia, but I think that removing any tolerance for it is the beginning of the solution. So speaking out, identifying, making sure that it doesn't happen, making sure that people are properly criminally arrested and prosecuted, I think is a solution. So I think that it's just another element where we have to have a heightened awareness and identify when these things are happening. It's just like what I said, like these people who are involved in this, they're definitely victims. They're victims in the worst possible way. You wouldn't want that to happen to you, your kids. So, I think it's important to just constantly keep aware. And I think that, you have to commend this administration for actually putting people in jail. And I think that that's where they belong. And just say this is a no-go zone. You set that standard. And I think that people will be disincentivized to get involved in these nefarious activities. They know that they can be criminally prosecuted, put in jail, or be exposed. Really, the first thing is to get, to expose people who are doing this, because once they're exposed, everything changed. Once Jeffrey Epstein kind of got exposed, a lot of people knew what he was doing for decades. But once that kind of people started asking questions and saying, hey, something really bad and evil's happening here, everything changed for the better. Now there's not people being drawn into some underground sex trafficking organization that only the Lord knows what happened to some of those kids. Not everybody came forward. Some people don't speak English. We just don't know. So I do think that it's the solution will involve everybody's involvement.
All right, hope you have enjoyed that. Thank you so much for being a member. Thank you for your time and for sticking with us until next